Most people imagine great discoveries happening in dramatic moments, deep inside tombs, hidden in caves, or buried beneath centuries of sand. But sometimes, history changes in a far quieter way. Sometimes, the key to unlocking an entire civilization is simply sitting there. In 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, a group of French soldiers was working on repairs at a small fort near the Egyptian town of Rosetta. As they moved stones and debris from the old walls, one officer noticed something unusual embedded in the rubble. It was just a dark slab of rock. Broken. Worn. Nothing that looked particularly valuable. But carved across its surface were rows of strange symbols, arranged in 3 different writing systems. At the time, no one realized it yet, but that ordinary-looking stone would soon become known as the Rosetta Stone. And it was about to unlock a language that the world had forgotten for nearly 1,500 years. At first glance, the stone didn't seem like a groundbreaking discovery. The soldiers who uncovered it simply recognized that it looked old. Interesting, maybe. But Egypt was full of old things. Ruins, fragments, inscriptions, reminders of a civilization that had already been studied for centuries. Still, the slab caught the attention of French scholars traveling with the army during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. When they examined the surface more carefully, they noticed something unusual. The text on the stone wasn't written just once. It appeared 3 times. At the top were the mysterious symbols known as Egyptian hieroglyphs. Beneath them, a flowing script called Demotic script, and at the bottom, something scholars could actually read. Ancient Greek. That detail immediately raised an intriguing possibility. If the 3 sections contained the same message, this stone might be more than an artifact. It might be a translation. The possibility was thrilling. But it also came with a problem. For centuries, scholars had stared at the mysterious symbols of Egyptian hieroglyphs without understanding them. Ancient travelers had described the writing. Early historians had copied the symbols, and entire walls of temples were covered with them. Yet no one could read a single sentence. By the time the stone was discovered, the knowledge of how to interpret those symbols had been lost for nearly 1,500 years. But the lower section of the slab offered a rare advantage. The text written in ancient Greek could be translated immediately, and once scholars began reading it, they realized something important. It was an official decree issued in 196 BC. During the reign of the young Pharaoh Ptolemy V, if the same decree appeared above in the other scripts, then the stone might hold the first real key to unlocking an entire lost language. For years, copies of the inscriptions began circulating among scholars across Europe. Drawings of the mysterious characters were studied, compared, and debated in universities and private studies. Everyone understood the importance of the stone, but no one could quite figure out how to crack the code. Some believed Egyptian hieroglyphs were purely symbolic decorative signs representing ideas rather than sounds. If that were true, translating them would be nearly impossible. But one young linguist started to suspect something different. His name was Jean-François Champollion, and unlike many scholars of his time, he had spent years obsessively studying ancient languages, including Coptic language, the last surviving form of the Egyptian tongue. Champollion believed the symbols on the stone weren't just pictures. They might actually represent sounds. If he was right, then those ancient carvings weren't just art. They were a language waiting to be heard again. Champollion began approaching the problem differently from everyone else. Instead of treating Egyptian hieroglyphs as mysterious symbols, he started searching for patterns, repeated groups of signs that might represent names. The breakthrough came when he focused on oval shapes carved around certain hieroglyphs. These frames, known as cartouches, were believed to contain royal names. If that theory was correct, those symbols might correspond to the names of rulers mentioned in the Greek text. One name immediately stood out: Ptolemy V. By comparing the Greek version of the decree with the symbols inside those cartouches, Champollion began assigning sounds to individual signs. Slowly, piece by piece, the system started making sense. And this is where the story becomes fascinating, because once a few symbols revealed their sounds, entire words began to emerge. Because what Champollion realized next would finally open the door to a language that had been silent for over a millennium. Once Champollion started assigning sounds to the symbols, the system began to reveal something remarkable. The signs weren't just decorative pictures, and they weren't purely symbolic either. Instead, Egyptian hieroglyphs worked in a much more complex way. Some signs represented sounds, others represented ideas, and many worked together inside the same word. To test his theory, he compared the cartouches of other rulers mentioned in Greek historical records. One of the most important names was Cleopatra VII. If the sounds he had identified were correct, the symbols in Cleopatra's cartouche should follow the same phonetic pattern. And when he mapped the characters, they matched. For the first time in nearly 15 centuries, scholars weren't just looking at hieroglyphs. They were starting to read them. By 1822, the pieces finally came together. After years of studying inscriptions, comparing symbols, and testing phonetic patterns, Jean-François Champollion reached a moment of certainty. The system worked. The symbols aligned. The sounds matched the names of known rulers. The ancient script was no longer a mystery. According to accounts from the time, Champollion rushed into his brother's office. Overwhelmed by the realization, he reportedly shouted, "I've got it," before collapsing from exhaustion after years of relentless study. Soon after, he presented his findings to the Académie des Inscriptions, E.T. Bell's letters in Paris, explaining how the Rosetta Stone had provided the crucial key. For the first time in over 1,000 years, humanity could finally begin reading the voice of ancient Egypt again. Once the system was understood, the impact was immediate and enormous. Using the breakthrough sparked by the Rosetta Stone, scholars could suddenly read the inscriptions covering temples, statues, and tombs across Egypt. Walls that had stood silent for centuries began telling their stories again. Royal decrees, religious texts, historical records, entire chapters of history that had been locked away inside Egyptian hieroglyphs were finally accessible. And what researchers discovered changed the understanding of ancient Egypt completely. Instead of relying only on Greek historians like Herodotus, historians could now read the words written by the Egyptians themselves. Pharaohs recorded victories, priests described rituals, and builders left inscriptions explaining how monuments were constructed. For the first time in nearly 15 centuries, ancient Egypt was no longer a silent civilization. Looking back, the most surprising part of the story is how obvious the clue seems today. The key to unlocking Egyptian hieroglyphs had been sitting in plain sight on the Rosetta Stone the entire time. 3 versions of the same text, one in hieroglyphs, one in Demotic script, and one in ancient Greek. But for decades, scholars approached the problem with the wrong assumption. Many believed hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, like a complex set of pictures representing ideas rather than sounds. That belief made the script seem impossible to translate. It took someone willing to challenge that idea, someone like Jean-François Champollion, to see the system differently. Once that mental barrier disappeared, the solution that had been hidden in plain sight suddenly became clear. Today, the stone that once looked like nothing more than a broken slab of rock is considered one of the most important artifacts in human history. Discovered by chance near the town of Rosetta, it became the key that unlocked thousands of years of lost knowledge. Because of the Rosetta Stone, scholars were finally able to read the voices of ancient Egypt again, inscriptions left by pharaohs, prayers carved into temple walls, and stories written by people who lived more than 3,000 years ago. What makes the story even more remarkable is how simple the turning point was. The answer wasn't buried deep underground or hidden in a secret chamber. It was right there, carved on a stone that countless people had already seen. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries in history aren't about finding something new, but about finally understanding what has been in front of us the entire time.